Okay, so it's time to start assembling the render passes in Photoshop to create the final version of the palace. So in a separate document I just started assembling all these passes, layered all the layers upon each other, and titled them. At the top I added a bounce pass. Basically the bounce pass is, I created it by turning off all the lights in the scene and then just putting a little omni light. Where the palace was in the concept art. Line it up. And then we're going to just try and tweak these layers and get them to look something like the concept art looked regarding the haze, the atmospheric values, lighting intensity. So what you'll find is one of the key points in rendering out your passes is that it gives you the ability to increase each individual pass on the fly in Photoshop. So since I put the ambient pass down here in the layer stack at the bottom, that lays down as my foundation. Above that I put my key light textured layer, which is just basically everything that the sunlight is giving us. And basically what that allows us to do is turn up or turn down the sunlight pass. When you turn it down, it simply reveals more of the ambient occlusion pass. On top of that, you can put the fog pass. In this case I have the fog black and the fog white. Those are simply the two renderings I talked about earlier regarding the shadow detail being flat or not. And then I have the bounce light pass at the top there, or near the top. So as you layer these things over top of each other, you can increase their intensities and just really play around, really using CG in kind of a painterly fashion in Photoshop. You can curve the fog layers, you can give them opacity, you can you even use the fog layers as an alpha channel and just paint a layer of fog. Using that alpha channel, it'll change the densities for you. There's really unlimited. Here we are with the bounce pass. You can see it's adding just a little bit of light near the foot of the towers on the left. I'm going to turn it down just because I don't want it to be as intense as the sunlight. But I think what would be happening there is when the sun hits the left side of the palace, it's going to bounce light back onto some of those towers. So you actually get a little bit of sunlight reflecting on the right faces of the two towers, especially the one tower that's closest to the palace itself. In scenarios like that, you typically get a lot of bounce light, and when you prepare a bounce light pass, you really have to make sure that you set up the light so that it's more than what you'd expect. You can always turn it down with transparency in Photoshop, and also just take into consideration the color of lighting that you're trying to mimic. The color in this case came from just the golden color of the stone, the brick. Therefore my bounce light was golden in color as well. So now what I'm doing is I decided that I'm going to keep a little bit of the palace that I've painted from the concept art. I'm just going to clean up its edges. And in parts, I'm going to actually just erase it completely, but what I want to do is I just want to clean up some of these edges on the rooftops in the rear here. I'm just going to keep that. I like the complexity that it adds to the whole model, but this way I don't really have to go back in there and add to the model and re-render my passes. I'm going to get rid of some of this other stuff, which repetition, but maybe what we can do is end up keeping that. It's kind of nice to have a little bit more architecture back in there. I'll just kind of adjust it, hide it a little bit, since it was painted pretty rough. And I'm just going to remove that tower and then paint in what should be there if that was just a rooftop and a wall, just by sampling the colors that I had chosen earlier. These little details are usually pretty fun to get in there and paint. You can get in there and detail them quite loosely, really, and because they're minor, they're minor characters in the big picture. You don't really sense that they're painterly. Really, the audience will be fooled by the success of the rest of the model, and little details here and there can be painted. I think very much just like the rock cliff to the right of the palace when I painted that earlier. Little details here and there, even though they're painterly, they're not really going to be objectionable, just because it's really, its foundation is something that's more realistic. So I'll get back to the vegetation. I'll take some of the greenery that was in the concept art, see if we can use any of that as a starting point. Really what I want is to have some greenery, some vines growing all over these faces, especially the lower faces. We don't want the vines to go too high just because this is such a massive palace. It might somewhat destroy the scale if we had greenery going too high up on the building. But if we go up, a few dozen feet, it's probably acceptable. Really, what I want this palace to look like in the end is a palace in the mountains, surrounded by trees and vegetation. I don't want it to look like just a piece of architecture inserted into a bunch of mountains. I do want it to have greenery growing around it and growing on it. Some vegetation growing on that colonnade over there, and up on the balconies. A lot of greenery in general is a very beautiful thing. And these are issues that should come into play when you're designing a matte painting. If you're asked to design an environment that is inviting, it certainly makes sense to think in terms of like an architect might, where you are trying to develop the environment with characteristics that people will be comfortable with. On the other hand, if you're asked to develop an environment that is somewhat intimidating or scary, then you want to take that into consideration, and you don't want to use these elements that like maybe waterfalls or beautiful lush mountains, things that you might see on vacation. It just makes more sense to, on every level possible, to try and consider those factors. And I think if you do successfully, then overall the matte painting will be more believable and have more impact. So I'm going to get back to the key light pass. If I put the key light pass inside this mask, I can then use the curve to brighten it up. That's the beauty to using these render passes. It allows you to, even though I put vegetation on layers above them, it allows me to go back and tweak them. I don't have to re-render any CG at all. So I'm just going to go and clean up some of the vegetation, some of the vines. Okay, so I'm just going to zoom out and take a look at the bigger picture. Go to 50%. As I said before, this is the final resolution for the matte painting. And it's important to step back and look at it at 50% and see what we're really going to see, what the audience is going to see. I always try and keep that in mind when you're painting, making decisions. Okay, so these are some photos that I took in Lake Merritt in downtown Oakland. It's a great place to take photos for a shot like this. And as I mentioned before, sometimes you don't always have the photos when you start off at your disposal when you start off on a shot. So about halfway through this shot, I went out to the lake and took some footage of some waterfront landscapes, a little bit of architecture, and as luck would have it, there was a white colonnade there with a slightly red roof, kind of matched what I was going for. Okay, so I'm just going to matte things out above the tree line. We'll try and keep the architecture, even some of the people, for scale. Keep the trees, the water, especially that concrete or stone edge where the water meets the land. It's one of the things that I really want to try and get in the matte painting. Try and scale it down into place. What I'm focusing on is trying to line up the colonnade right now. G looking real, more up to speed. If you dabble in little bits of photographic elements with your CG models, it can really help to enhance them and create the illusion that they are photographed as opposed to computer graphics. I'm not going to haze it back too much just yet, but a little bit of haze will help right now. Now there's 3 photos with different exposures of the same part of the lake. This one here is a bit bright. I'm just going to narrow it down and pick the best exposure for the land at the left. Basically, I can use some of these trees, some of the light hitting that little hillside, and maybe even the water fountain. quickly. I find that when I first put some of these photos in there, I don't want to spend too much time finessing them, just because I'm not positive if I want to use them, if it's the best solution. So I just grouped them with the other layer that had trees on it, and that way I can put them in the folder called Shoreline there, and I can share the same color curve, since the initial color of them was very similar. Rotate it into place just to make sure that things seem parallel with the horizon. I don't want the lake to feel like it's slanted off at some other in a different plane. And even though it's pretty rough, I'm liking the complexity that it's adding to the whole palette. See if we can just matte out a little more. Maybe what we'll do is we'll use just the left side of that photo with the fountain and the little hill on it, and we'll reveal a little bit of the photograph behind it. So now that I zoom out, I'm comparing the layer on and off just to see if it really was a good idea to put it back in there. When I saw the fountain at the lake, I thought that would be a great element to add in there. But now that I'm putting it in there, it doesn't seem to make as much sense with this lake, and especially because there's waterfalls nearby. It just seems like there's a little too much going on in the water. Okay, so I'm just going to go over to the right hand side there and put the other issue aside for now. Some of the perspective is off in the photo. What I mean by that is it just doesn't really match the perspective I established in the matte painting. So we'll try and make this section work. I think the rest of the photograph seems to line up, but for some reason this side is a little bit skewed. Now in Photoshop you can move the pivot point of your scale or rotate transform box. In this case I'm scaling everything upon that center point that I've offset. It can be a really helpful tool. Just continue tweaking the trees over here. Now if I nudge this photograph down, and move it up a bit. Since the palace is grounded behind the tree line there's not really any perspective cues that are telltale of being incorrect. It is a little higher than the concept art, but that's really just a minor change. Now in looking at the water still seems a little bit too blue. There's not really any atmosphere. There's not enough atmosphere on it, not for this environment. So I'm going to flash it a little bit and then address some of the dark trees on the left, maybe haze them back. This is an interesting topic that I see beginner matte painters struggle with quite a bit, and that is, well, when you take a photo reference, it comes from a photograph. You have something that comes from a photograph, and some people struggle with the fact that it doesn't always look real just because it was photographed. There are a lot of things that can happen in photography and feature film photography, footage and still photography, that can appear to look phony. So it's always important to have a critical eye and always be judging what's going on in your paintings. Just because it came from a photograph doesn't mean that it's going to look realistic when you put it in there. Just because we are going to add a little bit of a mist layer in front of everything, it'll help tie the lake together with the waterfalls and those trees and the palace. So we want the tree line to look like it's married in there with the palace. You just verify that by giving it a bit of transparency and seeing if it looks a little bit better, sharing a few of the values. So ultimately I'll leave it at 100% and get back over to the hillside on the left. So I put that little hill in behind the tree layer, the first tree layer. Because that first tree layer had a lot of elements that I think were pretty successful, I put the other layer behind it. The second layer has a lot of darker shadowed trees, though it has the hill that I like. The dark trees weren't really desirable. As I start to unmat the rest of the lakeside that wrapped around that little hill, I start to like what I see back in there. A little bit of architecture. You know, I don't really want to bring back those big skyscrapers, but the hint that there's some people back in there, a little bit of color, a little bit of light even bleeding through, catching the bottom of that very far distant hillside. I think that's overall it makes it look like there's a little bit less of a spotlight on our focal point. At Lake Merritt, and they have what looks to be just a big chaotic group of buildings, and I figured, well, if I could use some of this back in the matte painting behind the palace, it might look like there's a little bit of a town site that's starting to crawl up that hill. Because that part of Oakland does climb up the Oakland hills, have a little bit of architecture, houses and whatnot that are dispersed through the trees in the distance. The question really is, how bright should the sunlight be on those? And I figured, well, sometime back up in there in the distance, those houses are going to be falling into shadow because that hillside is in shadow. But I don't want a line that's too abrupt from dark to light, so I'm just going to carry forward with this and then darken it down a bit later on and try and get it to sit back there. So when you're looking at the shot, what you'll see is the palace for the most part, and in your periphery you'll sense that there's a large number of buildings back in there, so you'll assume that it's the local town site or the village. It's important to note that, again, you know, the scale that we'll see this final at, it won't be possible to determine what type of architecture is back there, and you know, how modern or how old and ancient it is. It'll just look like a chaotic group of pixels that have the impression of architecture. Now, because those buildings were in the sunlight, they do have a predominantly warm color palette to them, so I'm going to have to cool them off a little bit. I'm trying to add a little bit of that blue tone that we see in the hill, a little bit of magenta. You can see that I've added a layer, as I've done in the past, flat layer with some of the magenta, haze color that I pulled from the background. Put that over top of the rear town layer and just fade it out a little bit. We'll try sliding the town around, see if we can get a little more picturesque view of it. Something that works well with the palace as well as the little bit of waterfront there. Now I'm just going to select certain parts of the town and curve it so that it sits in there with the hillside and the lake and the lighting scenario all around. Just going to darken it down so that it doesn't draw a lot of attention to itself. It'll feel hazed back and in the shadows. So there's a little section here that needs to be addressed. Maybe it's a little bit on the bright side. The water overall just needs to be adjusted. A little bit too contrasty, so I end up basically what we've done here with all the trees. Realizing that what we need to do is flash those trees with that tiny hill in the sun. Try and make them match the trees that are lining the front of the palace. And along with that, a little bit of that water patch will come up as well. We'll address the water a little bit later on. So this building is another one of the buildings that I stumbled across over at Lake Merritt. I didn't go out there planning to shoot this building, but when I came across it, it had some similar characteristics to the concept sketch that I created. So I tried to shoot it from similar perspective, and try and get the sun angle to be similar as well. Because it has white walls, it's a decent candidate to match the architecture in the rest of this palace. Although we will have to tweak the rooftop and turn it red. The white walls, I think we can make them golden enough to match the rest of this architecture, and with a little bit of skewing, we might be able to get the perspective to line up if it's too far off. At this point in time, things look like they match quite quickly just by popping it in there and matting it out really quick. So I'm just going to do some color tweaking on the walls. I mean, we'll try and get the walls to come across, and then we'll select the rooftops and we'll add some red to them. I'm just going to continue playing with the scale of them, looking at the windows as cues. So the beautiful part about adding photos that are similar to your CG is that you do have certain ideas that are reinforced. You look at the windows and how they're dark, there's not really any reflections apparent in the photograph of that little white building. And that reassures me that what I've done in CG with the dark windows that lack reflections is correct. So the wall colors is similar to the shadowed wall parts of the palace. So I'm just going to go in and start selecting the areas of the rooftops that I want to change to a darker red to match the red rooftops on the palace. With a curve moderately quickly, you can get them to match. Because the photograph was in sunlight, I have the benefit of the the sun hitting that rooftop, and that's kind of reflected in the curve. Now, I want to have a little bit of sunlight hitting the left wall faces, so I matted that out. I'm going to brighten that up. Try and make it feel like we have the same light source as the palace. And then we'll try and simulate a little bit of a shadow on that wall. It should look like there's a shadow coming across that wall, probably cast from the palace itself. There we go. So I'm just going to group all those layers together so that I know that those curves aren't affecting anything other than that one building. A little bit more saturated because it's in the sun. And I think that'll about do it.